England, the land that has become the primary inspiration for most modern interpretations of that archetypal medieval fantasy. Let's take that one step further and turn the real country of England into a fantasy campaign map. Ahoy everyone, I'm Nazir North and welcome back to the channel. As requested, we are back in Wonderdraft for this video, this time looking at England. Asking ourselves, what might the map of England look like if we were to transform it into a fictional fantasy setting for Dungeons & Dragons or another tabletop role-playing game, or perhaps you might just want to follow along for the thought experiment. I'm going to be following the same process I used for the fantasy map of Wales, so if you haven't already watched that one, I'll add the link to the corner of the screen now. I'm going to start by creating a new project in Wonderdraft and setting my scale this time to 2048 by 2933. We're then going to import a vector map to give us our coastal outline. It's coming inverted, so let's just flip that. Already you might be thinking, oh wait Nazir, hang on, what about the southwest? Well, if you remember from my Wales map, I actually split the bordering lands of England into two parts, Albion and Breton-Tyre. So no, I haven't forgotten about Somerset, Dorset, Devon and Cornwall. In fact, they're going to get their own dedicated fantasy map in a future video when we explore Breton-Tyre on its own. Main landmass in, let's get our borders drawn. We allowed a little more space for Wales in our other map than it has in real life, so we'll follow that same border on the west. Then, as we mentioned, in the southwest we're going to split off Breton-Tyre, which we'll visit in a later video. In the north, and this might come as a surprise to viewers who aren't from Britain, but Hadrian's Wall is not the modern border of England and Scotland. Hadrian's Wall actually sits entirely within England. However, for my map, which is all about legend and mythology and imagining an alternate history of the British Isles, I'm going to give Scotland that land back. So I'm going to put that northern border back on where Hadrian's Wall is, which is roughly where the A69 is, that road that goes from Carlisle to Newcastle. Northumberland, I hope you like the sound of bagpipes because you're in Scotland now. Or, as we'll be calling it for this map, lending on that Latin name for Scotland, Caledonia. Now, we could have gone with the Scottish Gaelic Alba for Scotland, but we've already used Albion for the sort of main body of England from its Greek and Latin roots, so we'll stick with Caledonia in the north. I've just taken a moment off screen to import all of my label settings from our previous map project so we can get those nation names added in. Here we go. Albion for the main body of England, Cymru for Wales, which is Wales in Welsh if you didn't already know, Breton-Tyre for the southwest, which essentially means land of the Britons in the ancient Brittonic language, and then, as we've already said, Caledonia for Scotland, which is the Latin name derived from the Caledones tribal name. Okay, back to England proper, or should I say Albion. Let's paint in the ground. My preference is to leave the nations we aren't focusing on for this particular map in that base parchment colour, so we'll go right up to the borders and then come back and blend in the edges a little bit. If you're wondering about the Isle of Man and the Isle of Wight, the Isle of Man doesn't fit well on the map at this scale, so I'll perhaps cover that when we get to Scotland or even Ireland, and I've decided to give the Isle of Wight to Breton-Tyre rather than Albion, so we'll cover that in the Breton-Tyre video. Colouring done. For the geography, let's start off with the mountains and the hilly areas. We'll begin in the north because the south of England is pretty flat. The main areas to cover are the Pennines, the Lake District and the Yorkshire Dales. Then we've also got the North York Moors in the east and further south the Peak District. As with the map of Wales, I'm not going to try and exactly replicate real world geography to exact scale. This is just an approximation of the main geographical features of the region. In fact, I'm going to intentionally exaggerate and expand on some of these highland areas to give the map overall a bit more character. This is a fantasy project after all, and I'm not trying to make a realistic map of England. There are thousands of those out there already. The point I'm trying to make is if I do paint over your hometown with a mountain or miss out your favourite river, it's not because I don't like that particular place. Sorry, Gloucester, you're in Wales now. Northumberland, I hope you like the sound of bagpipes because you're in Scotland now. It's just a part of the process for creating these types of maps. I can't include everything, otherwise it would just take years to make a single map. Okay, so I've extended the Peak District right down, so there are just a few other areas to consider in the south. We'll add in the Chiltern Hills and the Cotswolds, and I think we will leave it there for hills and mountains. Okay, let's move on to lakes and rivers. I'm going to add in some of the major rivers, roughly following their real-world paths. But then to flesh out other areas, I'm just going to eyeball a series of smaller rivers that make sense geographically with the mountains and hills that we've already placed down. As part of that, I'm also just going to invent some new lakes that align to this new geographical layout we have. Next, let's add in the vegetation, the forests and the grasslands. As usual for these style of maps, I'm going to use that darker pine-looking tree for the higher altitude areas, and then the oak-type trees for the lowlands. I'm also going to add in some grasslands as we go as well. So as we're now pretty far away from real-world England, as we've done with the rivers already, I'm going to do the vegetation by eye. I'm not going to try and copy any real-world forests. I'm just going to let the rivers and mountains guide me as to where the vegetation should go, and we'll see what we end up with. In terms of asset scaling for the trees and the grass, I'm going to do the same as what I did for our map of Wales, the map of Cymru, which is set the trees to 50% scale of what the hills and mountains are on. The vegetation is usually the longest part of this creation process, but luckily for you, through some editing magic, ta-da! Vegetation all done. I'm going to do a quick recolouring of the mountains and hills to make them stand out a bit more, and then we'll move on to place names, my favourite part of these projects. For naming, sticking to what we did with the map of Wales, in this imagined version of the British Isles, I see the Romans as still having control of much of England, so let's start with some Roman place names. For London, we're going to go with the Latin name Londinium, a nice simple one to start. In the Roman times, this was a walled town on the north bank of the river, and the name is thought to mean place that floods, which is fitting because the Thames Barrier does not exist in this version of England. I'm not going to make London our capital though, we'll get to the capital later. The next Roman name we'll add is Camulodunum, which is underneath the modern day city of Colchester in Essex. Camulodunum is named after Camulus, the Celtic god of war, and it is the town with one of the oldest written references in the whole of Britain. The town is mentioned by Pliny the Elder in around about the 1st century CE. Moving a bit further north onto Lindum, which comes from the Brittonic Welsh llyn, meaning lake. It's on the site of modern-day Lincoln, and it was founded as a fortress for Roman legionnaires. Continuing north then we have Eboracum, which evolved into modern-day York. The name Eboracum is Brittonic, meaning the place of the yew tree. Now, we've altered the geography of the area a bit around York, so we're going to move Eboracum up into this valley. While there are many more Roman place names we could draw on, I'm going to leave it there for now, as I don't want the whole map to just end up being all Latin. Now, you might already be familiar with the Iceni tribe, as that is where Boudica is from. It's also the dominant British tribe in the Rome 2 Total War game. The Iceni come from an area that is now Norfolk, but Iceni itself is also a foreign name. It's a Latin name, not a native name. So for our capital city, we're going to bring it right back to its roots. We want the name that is unequivocally British. There is some debate around the origin of the name Iceni, but it likely comes from either the name of a local river or Achyn, which means oxen in both Brittonic and in modern Welsh. So, for our capital city, what I'm going to go with is Dinas Icon, which effectively means the city of oxen, or thereabouts. While on the subject of very old settlements, we cannot ignore Oxford, which houses the University of Oxford, which is almost 1,000 years old. Now, unfortunately, the etymology of Oxford, as you'd expect, is super simple and a little bit boring. Ox, ford. It's where the oxen ford, the place where the oxen cross the river. We're going to lean on some Brittonic and Welsh again, taking the Welsh for learn, which is dysgu, returning to oxen, achyn, to get achyn ddysgu, with the Welsh double D mutation softening the hard d into the. And that U at the end is pronounced E as well, ddysgu. Don't ask why, that's just how it is in Welsh. Achyn ddysgu. Because we've already altered the geography, our new place of learning is protected by this sort of valley, which in a way makes sense. You don't want your learning institutions to be vulnerable to hostile incursions. Although, as we are making a fantasy map, perhaps being near the mountains where the monsters are isn't exactly safe. Moving on, while we're in this neck of the woods, let's move a little further south to Wiltshire, to probably the most famous monument in Britain, and maybe next to the Great Pyramid of Giza, one of the most iconic ancient monuments in the world. I am of course talking about Stonehenge. Now, I could talk for hours about Stonehenge and the numerous other standing stones and Neolithic monuments in Britain, so I'll try and keep this one simple. Stonehenge and many of these surrounding sites are thought to have had a strong ritual connection with death and burial. So we're going to take the Welsh for dead, which is maru, and the Latin for stone and circle, which is lith and circulus respectively. Altogether, that gives us circulith of our. Once again, with that Welsh mutation, turning the M to an F, with the F pronounced more like a V in Welsh. Circulith of our. Taking a hiatus from history and archaeology and moving into myth and legend, and refreshingly using some modern English as well, let's move over to Dunchurch in Warwickshire. This is where we have the legend of the Dun cow, which is supposedly a giant type of cow with an inexhaustible supply of milk. Let's add this in as Dun cows roam. Next, St. George, patron saint of England. If he did exist, he almost certainly never came to England or even the British Isles. The historical St. George was likely a Roman soldier from Greece. But there is an extremely tenuous claim that he slew the dragon at a place called Dragon Hill in Berkshire, so as this is a fictional map, let's just add that one in. And on the topic of dragons and dragon-like monsters, we have the story of the Lambton Worm. This one takes place up in County Durham and is about a boy who skips church to go fishing. He catches an eel-like creature and throws it down a well. The boy then goes off and does some crusading, as you did back then, I suppose. And when he got back, this creature had grown into a massive worm or dragon, which the boy, now a man, was eventually able to kill. We're going to go with Wormswell for the name, and I'll place it roughly where Sunderland is, as the story takes place somewhere near the River Wear, which runs through Sunderland. Still on monsters, but away from dragons now and onto monstrous black dogs. There are stories of black hounds all over England, Europe and America. Sometimes the dog is an omen, or sometimes a literal person-eating monster. One of the most well-known stories are the Black Dogs of Dartmoor, which inspired Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes story, The Hound of the Baskervilles. However, that does fall outside of the area we're looking at for this map down in Devon. So instead we're going to draw on a number of other tales of black dogs from Lancashire, one of which is called the Grim. Dogs or hounds in Old English were called hund, so I'm going to call this place Grim Hund. Further north in England, the black dog is sometimes called the Barghest, which does also happen to be the name of a monster in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, with Barg or Berg meaning town and guest being ghost, making the black dog the ghost of the town, so to speak. I'm going to be really lazy with this one and just flip it and change the spelling slightly to get Guestberg. And we're going to place this one up near the Lake District. I'm leaving it at 2 black dog names here, but let me know because they really are fascinating. If you have any local stories or myths about a black dog where you're from, in England or anywhere else, let me know in the comments. I'd be really interested to hear about them. You might be wondering at this point why we haven't talked about the legend of King Arthur in this video, and that's because we already placed Camelot and a few other mythological Arthurian locations in Wales or Cymru in the last video. Now, we could do with another settlement up near the Lake District around Cumberland. And this one may seem a little odd, but stick with me here because this really is a British institution. It is the Cumberland sausage. Not only does the Cumberland sausage have protected geographical status like Champagne, but the history of the Cumberland sausage is said to go back at least 500 years. Yes, the humble Cumberland sausage is twice the age of the United States of America. You're probably thinking, Nazir, you're just hungry, and yes, I did skip lunch to carry on recording for this video this afternoon, but we're going to turn this into a place name. Both Cumberland and Cumbria have roots in Brittonic as Combroges, which means compatriots. So Cumberland is effectively the land of compatriots. As we're back into Brittonic, I can't help but also draw on the Welsh language here again. Land in Welsh is Gwlad. And the Cumberland sausage is traditionally pork, but let's make that boar instead of pig, as it evokes more of a fantasy feeling. I'm then going to mash all of this together to get Gwlad Gom Boar, with the Welsh mutation changing that K to a G. And I'm going to place this one next to one of the best modern English place names, Cockermouth. Yeah, that is a real place. We've already got a good few place names in now, so let's do a final pass and add in some more settlements where we have the gaps. In the real world, close to Birmingham, we have West Bromwich, home of the West Bromwich Albion football team, so there's a link to our nation's name there as well, but that's usually just shortened to West Brom. However, there is a fictional East Bromwich, which is the birthplace of the comic book character Hellboy, And there is another connection there to D&D, because Hellboy is half demon, half human, which makes him a Cambion, which is also a monster in the Monster Manual for D&D 5th edition. So I'm going to place the settlement roughly where Birmingham is in real life, and we're going to shorten it down from East Bromwich to East Brom, and then again to Eastbrom, as you could imagine the name over centuries of use evolving and shortening to become simpler so it rolls off the tongue more easily. One from a more modern mystery is the town of Argleton. Argleton is a completely fictional place that doesn't exist and has never existed, but around about 2008 it just appeared on Google Maps in a field roughly above Liverpool. Google quickly removed it once the media had picked up on it and people started to notice this made-up place, but there was never any real explanation of where the name came from and how it ended up on the map in the first place. So let's add that one in. Let's pretend Argleton is real and let's put it at the mouth of the river. I've got one more I'd like to add in the south of England at the site of Canterbury. In Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, one of the stories, the Pardoner's Tale, tells of 3 men who set out to kill Death. They are told that they can find Death under this old oak tree, and when they arrive they find this large hoard of treasure. They send one of the 3 men off to town to get some food and drink, as they make plans to carry the treasure back home. The 2 men remaining at the tree conspire to kill the 3rd man whilst he's out getting food. That would allow them to just split the treasure 2 ways instead of 3. However, the man out on the food run also decides to kill the other 2 by poisoning their food so he can have all the treasure for himself. You can probably already see where this is going. The man gets back with the food, they kill him, eat the food, then die themselves to poison. So all 3 men technically found death underneath this old oak tree. So in reference to that story and on the site of Canterbury, I'm going to add in Death's Oak. Even though there is so much more we could add to this map, I'm just going to add in one last settlement in honour of the tale of Robin Hood and Sherwood Forest. Even though the story of Robin Hood is likely fictitious, there are some very old references to the name Robin Hood, with one of the oldest of these being Rabenhod from the 13th century. So let's use that, and we're going to place it by this forest below the Humber River. On to the final naming exercise, let's label those mountain ranges. When I was doing my research for this video, I learned that there's actually quite a lot of controversy around the original name of the Pennines, with some claiming it comes from the Welsh for top, which is pen, and some claiming the name comes from the Apennine Mountains in Italy. There was even this whole saga of forged historical documents from the 18th century, which were later revealed to be fake, that tried to link the name of the Pennines back to a Latin root. So rather than going for a historical name for this, I've decided to go with something more colloquial. The Pennines are often referred to simply as the backbone of England because they run down the centre of the country. So let's take that as spine and then use Angles as in the people England is named after. So we get Anglespine. We'll extend that label so it effectively also covers the Yorkshire Dales, as well as on my map I've rather ungraciously merge them together. Over to the Lake District once again. The largest lake in the Lake District, and in fact in the whole of England, is Windermere, which is such a great fantasy sounding name already, so I'm going to give Windermere as the name to the area as a whole. And finally for the Peak District, which is way further south here than it is in reality, we're going to go back once again to a Neolithic reference. There are plenty of monumental earthworks and barrows in this area, so I'm going to go with the Barrow Peaks. Now, just to polish off and to match the style of the map of Wales that we've already done, I'm going to add in that scale, the compass, the windrows and the border. I know that the width of the Isle of Wight is about 23 miles, so I can use that to calibrate the scale, and then once we've added those extra elements in as well, we are all done, so let's do an export. England reimagined as Albion, a fantasy world ready to be dropped into Dungeons & Dragons or another tabletop role-playing game. If you've enjoyed this one, please remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel to stay up to date on future videos. And leave me a comment below. What other fantastical place names would you have added to this map of Albion? And what kind of maps would you like to see next on the channel? That is all for this one. Cheers guys, I'll see you next time.